The galaxy did not greet Ikaris with thunder or ceremony. It greeted him with weight, the kind that sits behind the eyes and makes even silence feel crowded. Awareness returned slowly, not as a sudden snap, but as a tide pulling back from the shore. Cold metal pressed against his palms, and the air tasted old, like dust sealed in a vault for millennia. The first breath carried no hint of earth, no sea wind, no warm sun, only a thin, recycled chill that belonged to machinery long past its purpose. Before we descend into the chaos of this tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more legends and dark histories from the Warhammer 40K universe. Memory rose in fragments, a life stretched across ages, battles fought in shadows, truths hidden behind obedience. For centuries, the role had been clear: protect the world, keep the secret, endure. And when that role collapsed, when the Celestials demanded their due, something inside him fractured. Not the body, never that, but the idea of what he was meant to be. An eternal built to guide humanity had once worn devotion like armor, letting mortals see a savior, a God-shaped guardian, because it was easier than giving them the full horror of the design behind the veil. That old pretense felt distant now, almost naive. In his world, worship had been a mask offered to frighten people, a story to steady their hearts. It had never been necessary for survival. Cosmic energy did not rise or fall with prayer. Strength, flight, and the burning beam that lived behind his gaze came from something older than temples. Belief had been for them, not for him. Here, belief was different. The ship around him was dead, but it carried an echo, a residue of what had once passed through this place. The walls were not just steel, they were scarred by symbols cut with purpose. Some were broken, some half-melted, others etched so deep they looked like wounds that refused to close. A pressure moved in the spaces between bulkheads, not air, not gravity, something stranger. It felt like a presence that did not need to breathe to be alive. Not a single voice, but the shape of a tension, vast and patient, like a storm waiting beyond the horizon. In that attention, Ikaris sensed a hunger that did not belong to any celestial vision. It was rawer, more personal, and it reached not for flesh but for meaning. The realization came with calm certainty, settling into the bones like winter. This galaxy was not empty of gods, it was drowning in them. Not distant creators who watched in silence, but living powers that fed on fear, rage, devotion, and despair. Here, emotions were not private things, they were currency, fuel, and chains. The thought should have felt absurd, but it did not. Across time, he had seen what faith could do. Entire civilizations had risen on it, entire cities had burned for it, yet those were mortal stories, fragile and temporary. This was something else. In this place, belief did not simply shape culture, it shaped reality, bleeding into a realm beyond matter, giving the unreal teeth. Every prayer became a spark, every scream became an offering. Every moment of surrender strengthened something hungry in the dark. A slow, heavy anger stirred, not the explosive fury of myth, but the quieter flame of recognition. Gods that drink from worship are never gentle, no matter what name they wear. On Earth, the lie of divinity had been used to protect humanity from despair. In this galaxy, divinity used humanity as food. The weight of that truth pressed inward. If these gods had noticed his arrival, they would not ignore it. A being powered by cosmic energy, resistant to corruption, shaped by centuries of duty and betrayal, was not a curiosity. It was a prize, a weapon, an anchor for rituals that could split worlds. Every pantheon here would want to name him, to claim him, to bend him into their war. Ikaris did not kneel to the Celestials, not in the end. He would not kneel here either. The old mask of godhood had fallen away long ago, leaving something harder beneath it, a will forged by purpose and loss. In the stillness of the tomb ship, the choice formed quietly, steady and low, not a vow to be worshipped, but a refusal to be owned. And as the dead corridors waited ahead, the galaxy's hunger began to feel like a summons, drawing him forward toward whatever waited in the dark. Awareness returned to a place that did not feel like a place at all. No horizon, no wind, no pulse of living ground beneath his feet, only the slow groan of metal adrift in endless dark. Ikaris opened his eyes to a ceiling of ribbed plating and cables that hung like dried veins. The light was dim and sour, not natural, not even truly electrical, a faint lumen glow struggling to exist inside systems that had already surrendered to time. The air was colder than any night on Earth, thin with recycled breath from whatever ancient engine still whispered somewhere deep within the hull. For a long moment there was only stillness, the kind of stillness that presses inward, making even a heartbeat sound like an intrusion. He rose without effort, body moving on instinct, cosmic energy circulating beneath skin like a quiet sun. The floor beneath his boots answered with a low, hollow echo, as though the ship were a coffin and every step reminded it of what it had tried to forget. This was not an imperial vessel, not any craft he recognized from the scattered memories pressed into him during his last days in another universe. The architecture was severe and alien, angles too sharp, corridors too tall, doorways framed by symbols that did not belong to any human hand. Black stone was fused into steel in places, and the seams between materials looked less like welding and more like scar tissue. The ship had been built by minds that did not care about comfort, only function, and even that function had rotted away. He moved forward, guided by the quiet pull of curiosity and the war-hardened caution that never left him. The corridor stretched long and narrow, its walls carved with repeating glyphs that caught the weak light and fractured it into thin, sickly reflections. Some markings were geometric and precise, others looked like scratches left by something desperate. Dried stains clung to the decking, rust-dark and layered, old enough to have forgotten their origin. Every few meters, a doorway stood open like a wound, leading into chambers full of shattered machinery and collapsed sarcophagi. The silence was wrong, not empty, not peaceful, but expectant. The void outside should have been the only thing listening, yet the ship itself seemed to hold a breath it no longer needed. There were no footsteps besides his own, no voices, no distant engines, and still the sensation of being observed lingered, subtle as pressure on the back of the neck. Not a presence with shape, but a gaze without eyes, ancient and patient, embedded in the very bones of this place. He passed a hall where statues stood in ruin, tall figures of unknown origin, their faces dissolved by time or war. Some had been toppled, others shattered into jagged halves, but all carried the same rigid dignity of beings who had once believed they would be eternal. Ikaris felt a faint echo there, not memory of his own, but the residue of other lives, other devotions, broken in this darkness. It left a cold taste in the mind, the sense of a civilization that had died without ever being mourned. A bulkhead ahead had been torn apart from the inside. The metal was curled outward like petals forced open by violence. Beyond it, a chamber yawned wide, its floor scattered with blackened fragments of armor and bone-dry remains. No sign of recent struggle, no heat, no movement, only the brittle aftermath of something final. The ship had not drifted empty by accident. It had been a tomb by intent, sealed around whatever ended here. The deeper he walked, the more the corridors felt less like engineered space and more like a preserved scar, a wound carved into the void and left to float forever. Time did not soften the wrongness. It sharpened it. Every surface spoke of a past too old to fit inside mortal history, a silence that had survived because nothing alive remained to break it. He paused at an observation slit cut into the outer hull. Beyond it, stars lay scattered like ash across a black ocean. No planet nearby, no orbital traffic, no sign of civilization, only the endless void turning slowly around a dead monument. The realization settled quiet and heavy. He had not arrived here by choice, yet he was awake, alive, and unclaimed, and in a galaxy where even empty ships carried the memory of gods, staying still would only invite the dark to find him first. With that certainty steadying his breath, Ikaris turned from the stars and continued into the ship's depths, the silence following like a shadow, and the unknown waiting just beyond the next bend. The corridor emptied into a chamber that might once have been a command deck, though nothing here resembled the ships of Earth or the hidden celestial constructs he had known. The space was circular and tall, a hollow throat of black metal and stone, ringed with alcoves that held shattered consoles. Most were dead, but a few still pulsed with faint, dying light like embers buried under ash. Strange cables ran along the walls in looping patterns, thick as coiled serpents, plugging into nothing, feeding nothing, still clinging to purpose out of stubborn habit. Ikaris stepped through the debris carefully. Underfoot, fragments of crystal and bone crunched softly, the sound swallowed by the chamber's vastness. A thin layer of dust drifted in the air, disturbed by his movement, catching the weak lumen glow and turning it into pale fog. The dust was not ordinary. It shimmered for a heartbeat and then dulled again, as if it held traces of energies that had faded but not vanished. His senses reached out, not like a searchlight, more like a quiet tide, testing the shape of the room, tasting its history. Nothing answered in the way he expected. No celestial signal, no familiar harmonic of cosmic design. The universe he came from had always carried a certain rhythm beneath matter, a subtle hum tied to the same cosmic source that powered the Eternals. Even in silence, there had been that background note, steady and ancient. Here, there was only absence where that note should have been, replaced by something heavier, stranger, like a second sky pressing down from within reality itself. He approached a broken viewing console. Its surface was etched with glyphs that did not match any language he had seen in his long life. The lines were sharp, precise, almost mathematical, yet the shapes carried an unsettling organic curve, like letters grown instead of written. He traced one with his fingertips. The metal was cold but not inert. Something faint moved under it, a residual charge that resisted definition, not cosmic, not electrical, not magical in any way he recognized. Memory tried to reach for context and found only fog. He had traveled across continents, across centuries, across worlds forged in myth and science, but this place did not recognize him. The absence of recognition was a kind of truth. A ship without celestial craftwork, without eternal design, without the faint cosmic signature that should sit in the marrow of any world he knew. The tomb ship was not built around his universe's laws, and his presence here was not part of any plan he had ever been told. A quiet chill settled over him, not fear, never that, but the sober awareness of being unmoored. Even when he had doubted the Celestials and rebelled, he had understood the stage on which he stood. Earth had been home, even when it felt like a lie. The stars above had belonged to a wider order, even if that order was cruel. Here, there was no familiar order, only a vast, bristling unknown. His gaze lifted to the center of the chamber. A column rose there, thick and angular, half fused to the ceiling, half swallowed by the floor. Around its base, small statues lay toppled and broken, their remnants suggesting winged figures with helms and weapons. Not eternal, not human. The shapes were wrong, too severe, too violent in their symbolism. Their faces had been scraped away deliberately, not by time, but by hatred. That hatred lingered like a stain, faint but unmistakable. The thought formed under his breath, steady and low. This is not my universe, not a dream, not a pocket realm, not one of the hidden celestial workshops. This was a different galaxy entirely, a place where even the dead carried alien purpose. The certainty did not weaken him, it sharpened him. There was no path back etched in the air, no guide waiting in the shadows. Only his own will, his own power, and the demand of whatever lived beyond these walls. He turned slowly, letting the chamber's silence settle behind him like a cloak, and began to search for a way forward, carrying that realization into the dark as the first true step of exile. A sound found him before light did, not a voice, not a language, but a rhythm, a faint repeating pulse that trembled through the ship's bones. It was weak, irregular, and old, as if it had been traveling for a long time through metal that no longer wished to carry it. Ikaris paused, listening. The signal was not cosmic, not celestial, but it had intent, a human intent, the simple, defiant act of reaching out for help even when help might never come. He followed it through branching passageways that tightened into a spine of corridors. The air grew thinner the deeper he went, and the ship's silence became layered, crowded with small mechanical groans that came and went like distant thunder. Bulkheads opened into elevator shafts that were dead, into rooms that had been stripped bare or welded shut. The pulse guided him on, always forward, always toward the outer hull. Eventually, it led to a sealed door set within a frame of darker metal. Glyphs like claw marks crossed its surface. The lock was dead. He placed a palm against it and pushed. The door gave way with a slow shriek, folding inward as if it had never needed much force to surrender, only time. Beyond it lay a viewing gallery. The chamber was wide, its floor sloping toward a massive broken viewport. Half of the glass was gone, replaced by ragged edges that glittered faintly. The void beyond pressed close, cold, and endless. Yet something else hung in that darkness, a planet turning slowly beneath the ship's drift. The world below was alive, not in a gentle way. From this altitude, even through drifting debris and distortion, the scars were obvious. Great wounds of fire cut across its surface in jagged lines. Cities burned like clusters of coals, sending pale smoke into cloud layers that churned with storm. Carriers and gunships moved above the atmosphere in tight formations, their shapes unfamiliar, brutal, more like armored beasts than vehicles. Somewhere down there, millions were fighting, dying, praying, screaming, and their suffering rose into space like heat. The distress pulse grew clearer in this room, broadcasting outward into the void, and now he understood its source. A hive city under siege, calling through static and ash for anyone, anything that might hear. The words were in a harsh tongue shaped by war, but meaning carried through rhythm. Aid required, enemy overwhelming, civilians trapped. The call repeated, a stubborn heartbeat refusing to stop. Ikaris felt the pull of it in his chest. He had been created to protect humanity. That truth had never left him even when he tried to burn everything else away. He had fought deviants, rogue eternals, gods in all but name, and every time the same boundary had held firm. Innocent lives mattered, not because of celestial orders, not because of worship, but because cruelty without resistance was the only true sin he had ever recognized. He leaned closer to the shattered viewport. The city's outline became clearer, vast and layered, stacked in vertical slabs like a mountain built out of iron. Above it, skies were blackened by smoke and tracer fire. Something like armored giants advanced through streets that glowed red with flame. Between them, crowds fled in terrified rivers. The scale of it was overwhelming, a war too big for any single hero to end, yet the suffering was not abstract. It was personal, sharp, and immediate. His mind reached for the configuration of the world, not Earth, not any star map he knew. The atmosphere carried a faint psychic bruise, a pressure that pressed against thought the way a storm presses against a shoreline. This was a galaxy where violence had been woven into gravity, a galaxy that had forgotten peace as a language, and still the city called. A quiet decision took form, not dramatic, not shouted, just a steady alignment of purpose with action. He would go down, not to claim anything, not to announce his arrival, but because leaving a world to burn when he could intervene would make him no better than the gods he had learned to despise. He stepped back from the viewport, feeling the dead ship's cold air against his face and the distress signal beating like a second heart in his ears. The void outside waited, the planet turning below like a wounded creature, and with calm certainty he moved to find a path out, carrying the city's plea with him as the next thread in his unfolding war. The tomb ship had no functioning hangar, no welcoming bay that opened gently into the stars. Escape required improvisation. He found a ruptured maintenance corridor leading to a hull breach, a jagged wound where the ship had been torn long ago. Beyond it, the void stretched clear, and the planet's bleeding glow filled one side of his vision. He stood at the edge for a brief moment, letting the cold of space press against his skin. Cosmic energy thickened beneath the surface of his body, sealing him against vacuum, steadying every internal rhythm. In that stillness, there was no hesitation, only readiness. He launched himself into the dark with a single controlled push, then let his flight take hold. The dead ship fell away behind, a silent monolith returning to drift. Ahead, the planet widened, its atmosphere swelling into a pale shell threaded with smoke and fire. The descent was smooth and fast, a falling without panic, the kind he had done countless times when answering crisis over oceans or rupture zones on Earth. Yet this was heavier, the gravity tugging with a stern, unfamiliar pull, and the air he entered was thick with ash. He broke through the cloud layer into a sky choked by war. Tracer rounds stitched red arcs across the air. Anti-air flak bloomed into black flowers of shrapnel. He angled away from the densest fire, keeping low, reading the battle by sound and motion. The city below was a layered mountain of metal and concrete, its streets narrow canyons lit by flame. Explosions rolled across rooftops like thunder trapped between walls. Somewhere inside that maze, the distress signal pulsed, now raw and close, a pain he could nearly hear in human breath. He touched down in an outer avenue already half collapsed, landing with force that cracked the ground but did not throw debris into the fleeing crowd nearby. Civilians ran past, faces gray with soot, eyes wide with the stunned terror of people who had been living under siege for too long. Some saw him and froze for a heartbeat, as if a statue from their myths had stepped off its plinth. Yet no worship rose, only shock, then more running. There was no time for anything else. The attackers came into view between burning hab blocks. They moved in packs, armored and brutal, with red insignia smeared across plate and flesh. Their voices were a chorus of feral devotion, a chant shaped by rage, not discipline. They carried chain axes and crude firearms that spat fire in short, savage bursts, and they advanced as though death were a sacrament. Ikaris did not wait for them to reach the civilians. Flight lifted him forward, a streak of gold cutting through smoke. He hit the first line with the force of a falling star, strength turning armor into scrap. One swung a chain axe upward, and his forearm caught it, durability resisting the teeth that chewed uselessly against cosmic-hardened flesh. A backhand sent the attacker into a wall hard enough to crater metal. Another lunged close, screaming a god's name. The words meant nothing to him. The cruelty behind them meant everything. Cosmic beams ignited behind his eyes, clean and fierce, cutting through the densest cluster of enemies without wandering into the fleeing crowd. Bodies fell in smoking arcs. The rest recoiled only to surge again, because rage was the only language they knew. He moved among them with controlled violence, not frenzy, never frenzy. Every strike aimed to end the threat quickly, to carve open an escape path for those trapped behind. Across the avenue, he saw a barricade of loyalist soldiers holding a fractured line. Their weapons were heavier than any human rifles he knew, their armor bulky and worn, yet they fought with a desperate discipline that reminded him of ancient legions, men who had accepted death and still found the courage to stand. They looked toward him with disbelief, but their fire did not falter. His presence did not replace their will, it reinforced it. The battle became a converging motion. His flight drew enemy attention away from the barricade. Their volleys thinned the packs that tried to flank his position. He did not speak to them, there was no need. Alignment was formed through action. Protect the civilians, break the attackers, hold the line. In the space between strikes, a quiet thought surfaced, steady and low. This galaxy worships war, but it will not decide what I am. He was not here because a god commanded it, not here to be crowned, not here to be thanked. He was here because suffering called, and he still answered. The avenue cleared by degrees, smoke thinning where bodies lay cooling. The loyalist line held long enough for civilians to pass through the gap he had ripped open. He felt the war around the city continuing to roar, far larger than this single street, yet the choice had been made without return. He had chosen a side, not to join an empire, but to reject slaughter. As the last civilians slipped into cover, more enemy voices rose from deeper alleys, swelling like a tide. He turned toward them, cosmic energy humming under skin, and moved forward into the fire, carrying duty like a quiet flame that refused to go out. The next wave did not come in silence. It came in a rhythm of drums and throats, a devotional roar that rolled through the streets ahead like a storm finding its shape. Ikaris advanced through drifting ash, stepping over broken masonry and bodies twisted by war. The avenue narrowed into an intersection framed by collapsed hab towers, and beyond it the attackers gathered in a mass that was less an army and more a ritual made of flesh. Their armor was mismatched but brutal, plated with scavenged metal and painted in thick, drying red. Skulls hung from belts and shoulder spikes. Symbols were carved into their helmets and exposed skin with the reverence of self-inflicted scripture. Some carried banners made from flayed hides, others dragged chains that clattered in time with their chanting. It was not a battle formation, it was a congregation. The way they moved, the way they howled, the way they threw themselves forward without fear told him something essential. These were not warriors fighting for land or survival. They were worshippers fighting for blood. A name rose from their mouths again and again, hammered into the air like a prayer. He did not need to understand the language to feel the meaning. It was a god's name, a god of rage and slaughter, and each time they spoke it, the air seemed to bruise, thickening with psychic heat. The chant was not merely for courage. It was an offering. Every heartbeat in their frenzy fed something vast, far away, yet somehow present here through them. Recognition settled into him, cold and sharp. In his universe, gods had demanded obedience through temples and oracles, through fear wrapped in marble. Here, devotion was a battlefield engine. It turned men into knives and then sharpened those knives with their own madness. They did not just believe in their god, they were becoming the shape of it. The cultists surged. He met them head-on, strength driving into the front ranks, flight keeping him mobile above the crushed street. Their crude firearms rattled off his chest and shoulders, stinging but failing to pierce. Chain axes screamed as they swung upward, but his hands caught steel, snapped hafts, tore weapons free. The brutality of their attacks was absolute, yet it lacked clarity. They were each trying to be the first to spill his blood, not to win a war. A larger figure pushed through their line. This one wore heavier plate, horned and wreathed in trophies. Its helmet was a snarling demon face hammered into metal, its chain blade huge enough to split a vehicle. The crowd parted around it the way disciples part around a prophet. It pointed toward him, and the chant changed, narrowing into a single purpose: take him, bleed him, offer him. In that moment, he understood he was not just an obstacle, he was a prize. The god behind these cultists had already felt him, had tasted the shape of his power, and now sought to drag it into its domain through violence. The realization did not frighten him. It clarified the stakes. A being like this would never be left alone. If one god wanted him, others would follow. He rose higher, letting cosmic beams flare. The front ranks collapsed into steam and fire. Still they came. Bodies tripped over bodies, driven forward by devotion stronger than survival. Their madness crashed against his calm control like waves against a cliff. He did not need to hate them to end them. Mercy here would only feed their god further. Across the intersection, he saw loyalist soldiers struggling to reposition, their lines staggering from the sheer weight of the cultist press. The larger champion turned toward them for a moment, perhaps sensing easier blood. Ikaris dropped between the champion and the barricade, landing with force that cracked the street and sent dust billowing. The cultists shrieked in rage. Their god's name poured from them like molten iron. He felt the psychic pressure rise again, a vast presence leaning in, watching through their eyes. It was not subtle now. It was hungry, impatient, and amused by the spectacle of worship in motion. Under his breath, the words came steady and low. Gods that feed on slaughter deserve no throne. He drove forward, cosmic energy burning bright beneath his skin, and the battle widened, no longer just a defense of civilians, but the opening of a war against a pantheon that would try to claim him by force. As the intersection shook with violence, a new sound cut through the chant, a deeper rhythm, metallic and measured, and he turned toward it as the next movement of the galaxy's conflict approached. Through the smoke-choked avenues came a cadence unlike the cultists' frenzy. boots striking pavement in unison, armored weight moving with purpose. The sound was not loud, but it was absolute, the steady advance of a force that did not need to shout to be terrifying. Ikaris glimpsed them first as silhouettes against a wall of fire, tall figures draped in midnight blue plate, each step placing them closer with patient inevitability. Bolter fire erupted from their line, sharp and disciplined. Explosive rounds punched through cultist bodies, tearing gaps in the congregation that had moments before felt unstoppable. The cultists howled and surged toward this new threat, but the newcomers did not scatter or break. They tightened formation, overlapping fields of fire, and advanced behind the storm they created. The contrast was striking in a way that even this brutal world made clear. Chaos rushed like wildfire. These warriors moved like an iron tide. As they closed, details sharpened. Their armor was massive, engraved with symbols that spoke of empire, sacrifice, and war carried across centuries. Their helms were expressionless, lenses glinting in the smoke like cold stars. Each carried a weapon that looked half machine, half relic, and each weapon answered their hands as if it was an extension of will. Ikaris had never seen soldiers like this. Not avengers, not eternal kin, not any army from Earth's hidden history. These were something beyond human limits, engineered for a war that never ended. The cultists slammed into them, and the street became a collision of devotion and discipline. Chain axes sparked against ceramite. Cultist blades found no purchase. The armored giants met the assault with controlled brutality, breaking bodies with rifle butts and power swords, stepping forward as if nothing could slow them. Their movements were too precise for ordinary men, their resilience too great. They fought like myths made of steel, and for a heartbeat, the battlefield felt like a legend being written in real time. One of them, slightly marked differently, moved to the front, a sergeant by posture if not by name. His helm turned toward Ikaris, reading him the way a veteran reads a weapon found in the dark. The bolter in his hands did not aim at the eternal, but it remained ready, held with a caution born of experience. Their kind did not survive this long without distrusting miracles. The two forces fought side by side without speaking. His flight pulled cultist pressure away from the Marines' flank. Their volleys thinned the packs that tried to swarm his landing points. He saw them reposition with silent signals, each covering another's blind spot, their discipline reminding him of ancient phalanxes refined into something far deadlier. There was a cold honor in it, an order that had learned to exist inside chaos without becoming it. When the last cultist in the immediate street died, the sergeant strode closer. The air around him carried a faint psychic gravity, not like the warp's hunger, but like a fortress of belief forged into doctrine. Ikaris felt it in the way civilians behind the barricades stared at these warriors with a mixture of hope and fear. The sergeant studied him for another beat, then spoke in a voice that cut clean through smoke. Not worshipful, not pleading, not the voice of a man encountering a savior. It was the voice of a commander assessing a threat. The words were harsh, clipped, demanding identity and allegiance, asking whether he was demon, man, or something worse. Ikaris answered without raising his tone. The truth was enough. Not a god, not a servant of darkness, only a warrior who would not watch innocents butchered. The sergeant did not relax, but something shifted in his stance, a fraction of acceptance based on action more than claims. In this galaxy, trust was earned in blood. Around them, the wider city still burned. More cultist chants echoed through distant blocks. More battles roared behind smoke walls and shattered towers. The sergeant gestured toward the horizon where thunderhawks and armored transports moved between fires, suggesting extraction, interrogation, command structures waiting beyond the street. He did not say surrender. He offered a path. Ikaris felt the weight of the offer settle. Alliance here would be a blade with two edges. These warriors were not gods, but they served something vast, something that demanded obedience in the same way pantheons did. Still, their discipline had saved lives he could not reach alone, and their war was clearly against the same hunger that had already sniffed his power. He gave a slow nod, not as a pledge of loyalty, but as a temporary alignment. For now, the enemy was clear. For now, the fight could be shared. The city's flames reflected in his eyes as he stepped nearer to the sergeant, and the battle widened again, carrying them toward the next truth waiting in this unforgiving galaxy. The street smoke drifted into thinner veils as the last echoes of gunfire settled. Around the barricade, loyalist soldiers moved to regroup, dragging wounded behind broken slabs of concrete while scanning alleys for the next surge. The towering blue-armored warriors formed a protective half-circle, not out of ceremony, but out of instinct, their bolters angled low, ready to rise the moment the city breathed wrong again. Even in stillness, they carried war like a second spine. Ikaris stood among the cooling ruin of cultist bodies, cosmic energy steady beneath ashen dust. The Eternal felt the weight of many eyes at once, the terrified civilians who had watched a golden figure tear through berserkers, the hardened soldiers who did not know whether to raise their weapons or their prayers, and most sharply, the silent attention of the armored giants in blue. Their presence was different from mortal fear. It was trained suspicion, the kind that survives not by hoping but by verifying. The sergeant stepped closer, armor bearing fresh scars, helm lenses fixed on Ikaris as if trying to look through flesh into the truth beneath. The question came without warmth, without hate, simply a blade of inquiry shaped by duty. Demon, man, or something that pretended to be both. The words carried the weight of a galaxy where deception was a daily weapon. Ikaris understood the challenge without needing the language to be gentle. In this war-scarred place, anything powerful could be a lie wearing a friendly face. The warp had already brushed his mind, already watched through the cultists' frenzy. A being who could fly through flak and break champions barehanded was not a comforting discovery. It was a danger that demanded a name. His answer did not rise into grand declarations. It came steady and low, aligned with the calm certainty that had guided him since awakening in the tomb ship. Not a demon, not a god, not a creature of this galaxy's madness. A protector that had followed a distress call. A warrior who refused to stand aside while butchers worshipped slaughter. There was no need to embellish. The street behind him held proof in the bodies that no longer moved. The sergeant listened without visible reaction, yet something small shifted in posture, a recalibration that did not soften suspicion so much as redirect it. The Eternal felt the gaze linger on his armor, on the faint golden shimmer beneath soot, on the way his cosmic energy sat in the air like a quiet sun rather than a warp flame. These warriors measured threats the way smiths measured steel, by testing how it rang under pressure. One of the Marines moved to the side, speaking into a Vox unit clipped near the neck seal. The words were too quick to catch fully, but their cadence carried urgency. Not a prayer, not a plea, a report. A commander calling higher authority to witness the anomaly standing in their streets. Ikaris recognized the pattern instantly. Councils of power forming around him, decisions being weighed without asking his consent. The memory of Earth returned like a bitter ember. Celestials had designed his kind to be instruments. For ages, obedience had been stitched into every mission, and when that obedience failed, when truth rose like wildfire, the response had been the same as it always was with pantheons: containment, control, bargaining disguised as guidance. The shape of it was familiar even in alien armor. Yet this moment was not only about him. Civilians were still moving through the gap he had opened. The Loyalist line was wounded, depleted, holding a city-sized front. Another wave would come soon, because in this galaxy war did not pause to admire victories. If distrust turned into gunfire now, the only ones who benefited would be the gods of blood and ruin waiting in the warp. So he remained still, hands open at his sides, neither pleading nor threatening. Let actions speak first. Let intentions settle into the world through what followed. The sergeant's bolter lowered a fraction more, still ready, but not aimed. A silent agreement formed in that narrow space between suspicion and necessity. Behind them, distant chanting rose again from deeper blocks, like a wound reopening. The sergeant turned toward the sound. Ikaris followed the motion, feeling the battle calling them forward. The first contact had not resolved trust, but it had cleared a path, and as they moved into the smoke together, the story shifted softly toward alliance shaped by war rather than words. The next streets were narrower, choked by wreckage and the heat of nearby fires. Loyalist soldiers fell in behind the blue-armored giants, forming a staggered line that hugged cover and moved with the discipline of people trained to survive inside hopeless odds. Ikaris moved at the edge of their formation, not because they asked, but because the city itself demanded angles of defense only flight could cover. Above the rooftops, smoke turned daylight into a rust-colored dusk, and the roar of war rolled through every alley like a living thing. The cultists had not retreated far. Their chants echoed from intersections ahead, sometimes fading, sometimes swelling, as if the streets were lungs pumping devotion into the sky. When the first pack came into view, the pattern between Ikaris and the Marines formed without conversation. Bolter volleys stitched the front ranks, opening gaps. Flight drove him through those gaps, a precise violence that shattered momentum before it could become a tide. Each side covered what the other could not. He watched the Marines fight up close now. Their movements were heavy but smooth, like mountains that had learned to dance. Every step was measured, every kill was purposeful. No wasted motion, no theatrical rage. Even when a chain axe struck armor hard enough to throw sparks, the warrior absorbing it did not stumble into frenzy. A power sword rose, fell, and the attacker collapsed. The discipline was so total it felt almost unnatural, a creed hammered into muscle and bone until emotion became irrelevant. That creed was not gentle. Ikaris saw it in the way they advanced through civilian quarters without hesitation, stepping over broken furniture and blood-stained icons, not out of cruelty, but because the mission left no room for sentiment. There was a cold mercy in it, the kind that understood hesitation as a luxury the galaxy could not afford. His own purpose aligned with the outcome, even if the methods felt distant. The cultist champion from earlier appeared again between burning hab blocks, wounded but unbroken, roaring devotion at the sky. The sight drew a faint tightening in Ikaris's chest. A leader like that acted as a living ritual, focusing the frenzy around it. If the champion remained, the worship-driven tide would keep returning. Without waiting for a formal order, he rose into the air and drove straight toward it. The champion turned, sensing the approach, chain blade lifting in a sweeping arc meant to hook a flying enemy from the sky. Ikaris let the arc pass beneath, then dropped low, catching the warrior full in the torso with a downward strike. The impact collapsed armor inward. Before the champion could recover, a beam flared from Ikaris's eyes, punching through helm and skull in a clean line of light. The body fell, and the cultists nearest it faltered, their chant cracking as if a priest had died in the middle of prayer. The Marines responded instantly, surging into their confusion. Bolters thundered in short, disciplined bursts. A second later, the street was a field of fallen bodies and fading devotion. Ikaris landed beside the sergeant as the last echoes died, dust swirling around boots and armored greaves. No praise followed, no public declaration of brotherhood. The sergeant gave only a tight nod, as if acknowledging a weapon that had proven reliable in battle. That was enough. In this galaxy, alliance was less about trust and more about survival against a shared abyss. Their enemies were not merely men. They were servants of a hunger that would keep returning until something decisive severed its hold. As they advanced, Ikaris felt eyes in the warp watching more directly now, attention sharpening into interest. The blood god had lost worshippers, and it would answer in time. Other powers would notice too. Even without speaking, he sensed the Marines understood this rhythm of escalation. Their pace did not slow. Their formation tightened. The temporary alliance had found its shape in the street's smoke and fire. It was a bridge built from necessity, not faith, and as the city's deeper districts roared ahead, both sides carried the same unspoken knowledge forward. This war had only begun, and whatever waited beyond these blocks would require more than solitary strength. With the champion dead, a strange quiet spread, not peace, but the brief lull between storms. The sergeant raised a hand. The formation halted. A vox crackled softly, relaying coordinates and threat reports from elsewhere in the hive. The loyalist soldiers used the pause to drag more wounded into cover. Smoke drifted lower now, wrapping the street in a haze that blurred the far intersections into ghost shapes. Ikaris stood near the edge of a collapsed plaza and felt something change. At first, it was only a faint pressure behind thought, like the air thickening before lightning. Then it grew into a distinct presence, not in the street, not in the sky, but in the space where minds touched the universe. The warp pressed against him the way deep water presses against a diver, invisible yet merciless, testing for cracks in will. A whisper did not form into words, not yet. It was more like a sensation of approval and hunger mixed together, a predator tasting the air after smelling blood. His cosmic energy thrummed in response, not because it feared corruption, but because it recognized intrusion. The Eternals had been designed to withstand world's ending. Warp temptation was different, not a force that broke bodies, but one that reshaped meaning. Images flickered at the edge of perception, a throne of skulls rising from an ocean of war. Battlefields that never cooled, their soil made entirely of bone. An endless roar, not from mouths but from reality itself, celebrating slaughter as sacred. The visions were not memories. They were invitations, planted directly into the mind the way hooks are planted into flesh. Ikaris held still, breathing steady. The pressure did not come from a single cultist or sorcerer. It came from something vast enough to feel the death of its followers across stars. A god that did not live in temples but in rage itself. The blood god had noticed him. The recognition was clarifying, almost cold in its simplicity. This galaxy's gods were not myths. They were atmospheric forces, and he had stepped into their weather. The whisper shifted, testing a different angle. Not just violence, but purpose. Visions of humans kneeling willingly, begging him to lead them. Worlds that would worship a golden guardian without question. The old temptation of being adored, being necessary, being the answered prayer of a desperate species. It was a lure shaped to fit his history, tailored the way a knife is sharpened for a specific throat. For a heartbeat, the memory of Earth flickered, the centuries of guiding humanity from the shadows, the way people looked up and believed without knowing what they were believing in. He had worn that belief once like a convenient cloak. It had helped protect them. It had also hidden the truth, and truth had been what finally broke everything open. Under his breath, the refusal came calm and certain. Worship is not protection, it is a chain for both sides. The warp pushed back, a pulse of irritation that turned briefly into heat, not enough to wound him, but enough to remind him the gods here did not accept indifference. They demanded surrender, and rejection was a challenge. The Marines must have sensed something. The sergeant turned slightly, helm tilting toward Ikaris, as if listening for a change in his breathing. One of the librarian-marked warriors further back shifted as well, gauntlet tightening on a staff-like weapon. Their kind lived with the warp at their borders. They could feel its tension, the way sailors feel a tide turning. Ikaris did not speak of it. There was no need for dramatics. The pressure was a private storm for now, and he knew giving it a voice would only deepen its grip on the street. Still, the touch left a mark, not on flesh, but on the direction of his path. This was no longer only a rescue. It was a declaration made by killing worshippers in plain sight. The gods had seen, and they would respond. The sergeant gestured again, signaling movement toward extraction points outside the hive's worst fire zones. The lull was ending. Sirens rose in the distance. Dropships roared overhead. Ikaris stepped forward with the formation, cosmic energy steadying like armor beneath skin, while the warp's lingering gaze followed from beyond reality. The wider horror had reached for him, and he carried that knowledge into the next street, as if it were a weight added to purpose rather than a crack in resolve. They moved through the hive's outer arteries with urgent discipline. Streets widened into industrial causeways, then narrowed again into service tunnels, where the ceiling dripped condensation that smelled of oil and ash. Loyalist soldiers folded into evacuation columns behind them, shepherding civilians toward armored transports that waited like iron beasts in smoke-filled clearings. Every step carried the expectation of another ambush, and every corner was treated like a potential altar for slaughter. At last the extraction zone came into view, a plaza once meant for cargo traffic, now cratered and burning. A Thunderhawk gunship crouched at its center, engines growling low as if impatient to climb. Its silhouette was brutal and sleek, wings broad, hull armored with the hard geometry of war. Around it, Marines formed a defensive ring, bolters sweeping arcs across roofs and alley mouths. The air shook with distant detonations, the hive still fighting in a dozen directions at once. The sergeant pointed toward the ramp, not a command spoken as ownership, but a practical directive, bored before the cultists regrouped. Their tone remained wary, yet the urgency was not theatrical. War demanded speed, and hesitation here would invite the blood god's servants to turn this plaza into another shrine. Ikaris looked once across the retreating civilians and wounded soldiers. The distress pulse that had guided him here was fading now, replaced by crackling Vox orders and the low sobs of people who had survived only by inches. His role in the city's defense was not finished in any grand sense. The hive would continue to burn after he left, but staying in this plaza to fight endless waves would help no one if the larger war required knowledge, allies, and an understanding of the galaxy's rules. He stepped toward the ramp, then paused long enough to make a boundary clear, not with a threat, but with the steady weight of truth. Cooperation did not mean capture. He would not be carried away in chains, not by these warriors, not by any god. The sergeant did not argue. A slow nod acknowledged the line, as if recognizing that any attempt to cross it would cost more than it gained. The first packs of cultists appeared at the edges of the plaza, drawn by the noise of engines and the scent of retreat. They surged forward with renewed frenzy, howling devotion thick enough to bruise the air. Bolter fire answered in disciplined bursts. The Marines held formation at the ramp, firing in measured sequences that kept the enemy from closing the final distance. Ikaris lifted into the air once more, not to fight alone, but to widen the defense. Cosmic beams carved through the densest clusters, each line of light placed to break momentum without scattering into the civilian columns beyond. Strength met those who slipped through the bolter storm, sending bodies crashing against broken cargo containers. The cultists fought like wildfire, but wildfire could not climb steel walls when a storm of bullets and cosmic force pressed it down. The last squad backed into the hold with synchronized calm. The ramp began to rise. Engines flared to full thrust. As the Thunderhawk lifted, cultists below screamed and threw themselves upward uselessly, their glory denied by distance and fire. The plaza shrank beneath them, a flickering wound of red light in a city still burning. Inside, the hold was stark, designed for towering transhuman frames. Ikaris sat in a reinforced jump seat that groaned faintly under his weight. The sergeant secured his weapon and faced him across the cramped hold. No gratitude attempted, only a grim recognition that this battle had not ended anything. It had merely announced a new player to the gods of the warp. The gunship punched through cloud layers, leaving smoke and fire behind. Through a small viewport, the hive's spires receded, their burning tops vanishing into rust-colored storm. Beyond the atmosphere, the void opened black and immense, and ahead a massive warship waited, a fortress among stars. Ikaris felt the warp's attention still lingering at the edges of thought, a low simmering heat that promised pursuit. The sergeant's voice came steady and low, warning that the blood god did not forget defeat, that grudges were carried across millennia. Ikaris did not answer with anger. Let gods remember, he thought, calm as stone. Let them learn what stands against worship armed with slaughter. The Thunderhawk angled toward the waiting battle barge, and the extraction became a transition rather than an escape, carrying him deeper into a galaxy where every alliance was provisional, and every step forward pulled another pantheon's gaze. The battle barge swallowed the Thunderhawk into a cavern of steel and roaring engines. The gunship's ramp lowered into a hangar vast enough to be a city square, filled with cranes, armored vehicles, and ranks of Marines marching in precise lines. Servitors moved along rails overhead, hanging like silent insects from the ceiling. The air was heavy with machine oil, incense, and the distant hum of power systems that could crack a planet if commanded. Ikaris stepped down into that space and felt the weight of empire settle around him. Not worship exactly, but a different kind of gravity, the pressure of a civilization that had survived by turning belief into doctrine and doctrine into war. Crew and soldiers stared as he passed. Some made signs with their hands, gestures of warding or reverence. Others simply watched with the blank, disciplined caution of those trained to see miracles as potential weapons. The sergeant guided him through corridors that felt carved rather than built. Each passage was enormous, scaled for transhuman bodies. Walls were lined with banners and skull motifs, symbols of victory and warning intertwined. The ship's heartbeat thrummed underfoot, deep and constant, as if the vessel itself was alive and suspicious of what had entered it. They reached a chamber guarded by Marines in heavier armor. The doors opened into a circular hall lit by cold lumens and flickering hollow screens. At its center, an assembly of imperial authorities waited, robed inquisitors, librarians, an apothecary whose white armor was etched with medical sigils, and officers whose augmentations gleamed dully in the light. The sergeant and his squad stood to one side, their roles shifting from battlefield partners to witnesses. The inquisitor at the center was a man of scars and machinery, face half human, half rebuilt from past wars. His remaining eye studied Ikaris without flinching. The first words came measured and sharp, stating what their probes had already decided. He was not of this galaxy, not demon, not Xenos as they understood it, something else, something with a signature that felt like warp energy and yet did not bend to warp law. The librarians had already pressed against his mind during transit through the ship's deeper halls, testing for corruption, for hidden allegiance, for the psychic taint that marked chaos. It had been irritating, but not threatening. Cosmic energy did not recoil from their touch the way mortal thoughts might. Still, the examination carried an implication Ikaris recognized too well, a council deciding the fate of a powerful outsider. The apothecary stepped forward to report on his physiology, calling him human by structure but inconsistent by essence. Regeneration beyond any imperial record, durability that rivaled beings they called primarchs, energy in his cells that did not match warp patterns yet resisted warp infection. The tone was clinical, but the meaning was clear. Such a being could turn the tide of wars or destroy the ship if provoked. The Inquisitor's dilemma followed naturally: what to do with a weapon that did not belong to any protocol, how to prevent chaos from claiming him, how to prevent him from becoming a threat if left untethered. Their discussions slid toward containment and cooperation, like two blades on the same hinge. He listened, and old anger stirred, quiet but deep, these mortals speaking about him as if he were a relic on a table, as if he were absent. The pattern repeated across realities, gods deciding destinies, councils weighing lives. Here it was mortals with empire behind them, but the arrogance felt similar. His voice cut through the chamber, low and steady, carrying to every corner. No one's weapon, not theirs, not the Warp S, not any emperor's shrine. He had been made into a tool once, and that road ended in rebellion and ruin. The threat was not shouted. It was the simple truth of history. Hands moved toward bolters. A moment of tension tightened the air. The Inquisitor raised a hand to still them, eyes narrowing not in fear but in calculation. He spoke again, reframing the debate not as ownership but alignment. The Imperium did not claim to enslave him, only to decide if cooperation was possible, if goals could overlap enough to avoid conflict. The galaxy was drowning in threats, and if Ikaris wished to fight the gods hunting him, imperial resources might help. Ikaris weighed the offer with cold clarity. The emperor they served sounded like another absent god, worshipped despite denials. Yet chaos was already reaching for him, and humanity here lived under divine predation on a scale Earth had never known. Cooperation did not require belief, it required purpose. He gave no vow of loyalty, he gave a boundary and a direction. No kneeling, no worship, no interference unless their empire became another pantheon exploiting mortals. But against chaos and any god that fed on humanity, interests aligned. The Inquisitor accepted that line with a thin, satisfied calm, a dangerous asset, yes, but too potent to discard. The chamber's tension eased into something colder, more political. Status was offered, operative rather than captive, freedom with a tether of shared war. As the meeting closed, Ikaris felt the ship's engine hum deepen, the sense of motion beginning beneath metal. Somewhere ahead, another tier in reality waited, another god's plan. The alliance was provisional, the war inevitable, and with that knowledge settling like armor around resolve, he followed the sergeant out into the ship's vast corridors, carrying the story softly toward the next escalation. The corridors beyond the Inquisition chamber felt colder than the hangar, not in temperature, but in spirit. Each step through the battle barge carried him deeper into an empire that had been built like a fortress around fear. Metal saints and skulls watched from alcoves. Banners hung heavy with soot and old blood. The ship was a moving cathedral of war, and its air tasted of incense meant to mask the scent of death that never truly left. Sergeant Titus walked ahead in silence, guiding him through a maze of vaulted passageways. The Marine's presence was steady, disciplined, and for now respectful of the boundary Ikaris had laid down, yet the larger machine of the Immaterium was already turning around him. Whispered rumors followed in the wake of his passage. Crew stepped aside as if a relic had entered their halls, others stared with a kind of wary hunger, the look of people desperate for miracles in a galaxy that offered mostly graves. Ikaris watched the reactions without engaging them. A long life among humans had taught him that awe could become chains faster than iron ever could. On Earth, faith had been something he allowed for their sake, a myth that steadied fragile hearts in the dark. Here, faith was an institution sharpened into obedience. Even those who claimed to reject gods built their world around one absent throne. Denial did not stop worship, it only made worship more rigid, more dangerous. The thought threaded in quietly, firm as stone. Mortals always replace one altar with another. The Celestials had demanded compliance in the name of cosmic order. The Olympians of old myth had demanded devotion in the name of dominance. Now the Imperium demanded loyalty in the name of survival. Different masks, same hunger to make the powerful kneel into usefulness. The Inquisitor's words had been careful, almost reasonable, but the structure behind them was not built for equals. It was built for tools. He remembered the counsels of his own kind, the way purpose had been assigned as if it were destiny. He remembered the moment obedience broke, the way truth had cost everything, the way freedom had felt like stepping off a cliff into void. Even then, he had not been crushed by the fall, he had been freed by it. In this new galaxy, another cliff waited. Cooperation promised resources, intelligence, a road through wars too vast to navigate alone. Yet cooperation also promised the slow tightening of expectation. Fight where they say, kill what they name, become the blade they point. That was how pantheons always worked. The chain was rarely offered openly. It was offered through gratitude, necessity, and the quiet pressure of a billion lives calling for a savior. A low fury stirred, not to burn alliances, but to keep his core intact. Cosmic energy glowed faintly under skin, a reminder of what could not be owned. He did not need worship to exist. He did not need an empire to define purpose. The galaxy's gods could tempt and threaten, the Imperium could bargain and scheme, but none of them could rewrite what he had already chosen, to stand between tyrant gods and the mortals they fed upon. They reached a smaller chamber set aside as quarters, the door sealed behind with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, the space was spare but functional, larger than a crew bunk yet stripped of comfort. A narrow cot, a weapons rack bolted into the wall, a small viewing slit toward the void. The Imperium understood utility. It had given him room to breathe, but not the illusion of belonging. Titus paused at the threshold, explaining the next phase in simple military cadence. A new mission, a warp disturbance in another sector, possibly tied to his arrival. The words carried an offer disguised as a plan, an invitation to step further into their war. Ikaris listened, calm and unreadable, letting the shape of the galaxy settle in his mind. He gave a slow nod to the sergeant, neither surrender nor refusal. Purpose aligned for now, and alignment was enough. As the Marine withdrew, the hum of engines deepened, signaling course changes beyond the walls. Ikaris turned toward the viewing slit, the void staring back like a silent oath. The path ahead would be walked without kneeling, and that certainty carried him into the next movement of the story like a steady ember passed hand to hand. The hours that followed were filled with motion, though much of it happened beyond his quarters. The ship's deep vibrations shifted subtly as engines adjusted for departure. Footfalls thundered past the corridor outside, Marines moving to stations, crew sealing deck hatches, servitors gliding by with crates of ammunition and ritual tools. War preparation here was not frantic, it was ceremonial, a practiced rhythm repeated across centuries of conflict. A summons arrived without flourish. Two Marines in heavier armor waited beyond the door, silent escorts rather than guards. Ikaris followed, senses tuned to the ship's mood. The battle barge was a world unto itself, every hallway an artery, every chamber a heart built for conquest. Its scale was meant to humble mortals. It did nothing to him. Cosmic endurance carried his steps steady, eyes reading the Empire's bones as if studying the skeleton of a beast. They returned to a council chamber smaller than the earlier conclave, but thicker with intent. The Inquisitor stood at the center, scarred face half-lit by a hololithic map of star systems crawling with threat markers. Titus was present to the side, rigid at attention, clearly assigned as liaison. The arrangement was being formalized, not as a plea, but as a structure. The Inquisitor spoke of precedent with the calm weight of someone who had ordered worlds to burn. The Imperium had used strange and dangerous tools before, if survival demanded it. Here was the offer. Ikaris would operate freely against threats aligned with the interests of humanity. He would not be placed in a chain of command like a soldier. He would be given targets, intelligence, and support when goals overlapped. In return, he would not undermine the imperial creed within their domains, and he would not turn his power against their forces unless they became a threat to humanity themselves. The words were shaped like cooperation, but the edge beneath them remained sharp. A blade without a hilt, the Inquisitor had called him earlier. Dangerous to hold, dangerous to discard. The Empire's logic was brutally simple. If he walked alone, chaos would hunt him and perhaps one day consume him, then turn that power against mankind. If he walked with them, they gained a weapon that could wound gods. Either way, he was a variable they could not ignore. Ikaris felt old patterns stir beneath the surface. Celestials offering purpose with a hidden leash. Leaders offering partnership while calculating how to control outcomes. Even sincere mortals carried the instinct to tame what frightened them. Yet he also saw the desperation that fueled this arrangement. Billions of humans lived under constant predation by gods, demons, and alien empires. Many of those threats had already brushed against him. If he wanted a path through this galaxy, he needed maps and ships more than pride needed solitude. The answer formed measured and clear. No kneeling, no worship, no claim of ownership. He would not serve an emperor as a god, and he would not be paraded as a miracle, but he would fight chaos and anything like it because those gods fed on human suffering. Resources were accepted as tools, not as chains. Cooperation would last as long as the Imperium's goals stayed aligned with protecting humanity rather than exploiting it. The Inquisitor listened, then inclined his head slightly, the gesture of someone who could accept a compromise because it still served survival. Formal status was given, operative under Ordo Malleus authority, free to pursue targets with Imperial backing. Titus's squad would remain attached, partly for coordination, partly as a quiet tether. The arrangement closed like a lock turning. A new disturbance was then shown on the holomap, a tear in reality on the edge of a distant arm. Reports suggested the breach was stable, unlike typical chaos portals. It might be connected to his displacement, perhaps even to the celestial echoes he carried. Opportunity and threat intertwined again. The Inquisitor's tone made clear that delay would only widen the wound. Ikaris thought of the tomb ship, of waking unmoored in the void. Answers mattered now, not for nostalgia, but for clarity. If something had thrown him into this galaxy, knowing what and why could decide whether he was being hunted by chance or by design. He gave a quiet nod. The mission would be taken. As the council ended, the ship's engines thrummed harder, warp translation imminent. The Inquisitor left him with a final measured warning about what waited in the Immaterium. Titus guided him back toward quarters and armory, the Empire's machinery closing around this new partnership. A knife with no handle had agreed to be carried, and the story moved forward on that uneasy edge, passing into darkness with purpose held tight. Warp translation began like a pressure shift under the skin rather than a sound. The battle barge's metal seemed to breathe for a heartbeat, then reality bent around it. Ikaris felt the moment as a subtle lurch in the bones, the way a realm changes when its rules are briefly suspended. Outside the viewing slit of his quarters, stars smeared into pale streaks, then vanished, replaced by a swirling ocean of unnatural color that made his senses recoil and lean forward at once. The Immaterium did not look like any space he knew. It was not void, not vacuum, not the clean brilliance between worlds. It was alive in a way that felt intimate and invasive. Shapes moved in the color without obeying physics. Currents of light folded into themselves, then burst outward with the logic of emotion rather than matter. It was a sea made of thought, and the ship cut through it inside a bubble of protected reality, its gellar field humming like a shield held against a storm. At first, the pressure was faint, a brushing at the edge of consciousness, like fingers testing a closed door. Then whispers came, not aloud but directly into thought, promises shaped into images, tailored to wounds he had carried across centuries. Earth rebuilt in peace, humans looking toward him with gratitude instead of fear. Eternal kin restored, their divided purpose made whole, a voice that tried to feel like belonging. Under his breath, the refusal stayed calm. Belonging bought with worship is a cage. He had stood in temples where mortals knelt for salvation and then watched those temples crumble under the weight of their faith. He had seen how easily reverence became obedience and how obedience became sacrifice. The warp offered crowns made of hunger, and he had no need of them. The whispers shifted, cleverer now. Visions of the Celestials, vast figures of judgment, their cold design revealed as cruelty without conscience. The Immaterium showed them not as creators, but as tyrants, implying that chaos might be the rightful rebellion against such order. It was a trap shaped like liberation, and he recognized it instantly. Freedom that requires surrender is not freedom. Pressure tightened. The warp gods pressed harder against his will, changing tactics from seduction to assault. Images flooded the mind like wildfire, not beautiful now, but cruel. Humanity torn apart under demonic claws, civilizations screaming as planets cracked. The faces of those he had failed, those he could never save, rising from ash to accuse him of weakness. The assault was designed to break resolve through guilt. Ikaris held steady, letting cosmic energy anchor him. These gods did not know him personally the way the Celestials had. They knew only the outline of his history. Their blades were sharp, but the distance between stranger and victim blunted them. Pain passed through him without reshaping his core. The storm could howl. The fortress remained. Days blended into a slow siege. Alarms occasionally flared through the ship when warp eddies battered the gellar field. Crew chanted litanies over Vox channels. Marines stood in silent vigil at key junctions, their empire's faith acting as a wall against madness. Ikaris watched it all without joining their prayers, yet understanding their need. In the Immaterium, belief was insulation. Near the end of transit, a more focused presence arrived. Not raw rage, not decay, not excess, but something with an almost cold intelligence. The changer of ways touched his mind like a scalpel. The voice that formed there was smooth, persuasive, radiating a confidence that tried to feel like reason. It spoke of choice, of pathways, of rebellion against tyranny, drawing a line between chaos and the Imperium as if one were freedom and the other chains. He listened without flinching. The Imperium was harsh, yes. Its wars were brutal, yes. The visions the Changer showed were real enough to be plausible. Worlds burned by their own defenders, populations sacrificed for survival, inquisitors executing the innocent to prevent a larger fall. None of it surprised him. Mortals in desperate universes make desperate cruelty. That truth did not make chaos righteous. It only proved that gods and empires both use suffering as currency. The answer came steady. I do not need your paths, I need purpose. Purpose did not require joining the storm that fed on human despair. The Changer withdrew with a faint ripple of irritation, leaving behind seeds of doubt it hoped would sprout later. Ikaris felt those seeds fall away like ash. Doubt might return as strategy, but worship would not. The ship surged toward its exit point. Warp colors began to thin. Reality gathered itself around the hull once more. As they returned to real space, the pressure vanished, leaving only the echo of being watched. Ikaris stood in the quiet of his quarters, breath even, cosmic energy steady, and the war ahead felt clearer rather than heavier. The gods had tested him and found nothing to claim, and that quiet victory carried him forward into the next chapter like a calm handoff into dawn. Real space returned with a snap of clarity that felt almost relieving. The void outside the viewing slit was black and honest again, stars fixed and cold, yet the ship's mood was not calm. Vox announcements rolled through corridors with clipped urgency. Marines moved with purpose toward deployment bays. Servitors hauled crates labeled with seals of warding. The Inquisitor's new mission had teeth, and the battle barge was already orienting itself toward it. Titus arrived at the threshold of Ikaris's quarters without ceremony. Armor was freshly cleaned, yet the eyes behind the helm carried the same grim steadiness as in the hive. A frontier world had been identified, primitive by imperial standards, but dense with human life. A dimensional wound had opened there, stable rather than chaotic, emitting a consistent energy profile that did not match standard warp behavior. The tier was widening slowly, and ritual activity had been detected on the surface. Ikaris followed Titus through the ship's arteries toward the deployment bay. The passageways were alive now with coordinated motion. Blue-armored giants locked weapons into mag clamps. Tech priests anointed engines with oils while chanting binary prayers. The Imperium prepared for war the way a body prepares to breathe, without question, without hesitation, because to stop would mean suffocation. They boarded a Thunderhawk again, this time among a larger strike complement. The gunship's hold was crowded with heavy armor, medikey supplies, and portable warding pylons meant to stabilize reality near the breach. Ikaris stood near the rear ramp as engines lifted them into the void, his gaze steady on the planet swelling ahead. Kronos 4 was a different kind of world than the Hive. From orbit, it looked almost beautiful. Vast green forests, mountains like old stone spears, rivers cutting silver veins through dark valleys. Settlements clustered in primitive patterns that reminded him faintly of ancient Earth, a place still close to soil and sky. Yet beneath that beauty sat a wrongness he could feel even before atmosphere touched skin. The air above the northern hemisphere shimmered with a subtle golden pulse, too steady to be chaos, too bright to be natural. The Thunderhawk descended through rolling storm clouds into a clearing near a great forest. The craft landed with a controlled thud, ramp lowering into damp earth. Ikaris stepped out and tasted the air. Ozone and ash lingered faintly, the smell of lightning after a battle. The forest was still in a way that felt unnatural. No birds called, no animals stirred in the underbrush. Even the trees seemed to shiver in slow rhythm, as though listening to something deeper than wind. Titus ordered formation. Marines fanned into a tactical wedge, taking point along a rocky ridge leading toward the valley where the tier had been sensed. Ikaris moved with them, endurance steady, cosmic energy humming low like a hidden sun. the land's silence pressed in, and every step deeper into the forest felt like walking toward a voice that had not yet spoken but already knew their names. As the ridge crested, the valley opened below. Ancient stone markers dotted the depression, burial monuments for warriors who had lived and died long before the Imperium found this world. At the center hung the breach. It was immense, a vertical wound in the air, perhaps 200 meters tall, edges glowing with golden energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. Unlike the ragged warp tears he had seen in the hive or felt during transit, this one held its shape with stubborn consistency, as if reality itself was being held open by a different law. Through its translucent surface, another realm could be glimpsed. Marble columns, clear blue skies, a sun that felt achingly familiar. The sight struck Ikaris like a memory sharpened into steel. Not his universe exactly, but close enough to resonate in his bones. A celestial echo, a ghost of home, shining through the tear as if calling him across realities. Titus looked to him for confirmation, and Ikaris gave a slow, sober nod. The wound was connected to something older than chaos, something tied to cosmic design. Whatever had brought him here had left another door half open, and now gods and mortals alike had gathered around it. Below, hooded figures knelt in concentric circles, chanting in a language that scraped against the mind. Armored warriors stood guard around them, their plate-bearing symbols that had no imperial origin. The ritual was not strengthening a chaos fire, it was stabilizing the golden tear, feeding it with belief and blood. Ikaris felt purpose settle with calm certainty. This mission was no longer only imperial, it was personal, tied to the question of why he stood in this galaxy at all. The valley waited like a held breath, and as the strike force began its descent, the story passed softly into the next revelation, a celestial echo about to become a battlefield. The descent into the valley felt like walking into the center of a storm that had not yet broken. The golden breach towered above the burial stones, its light painting long pale lines across the grass and rock. Each pulse spread through the air with a clean, almost crystalline rhythm, nothing like the warp's fevered turbulence. It felt engineered, deliberate, as if a cosmic hand had torn the veil and then held it open with steady intent. Ikaris kept eyes on the surface beyond the tear, letting recognition settle without letting it soften vigilance. Marble colonnades rose in that other realm, bright under a clear sky that belonged to no storm. The architecture carried the same sacred symmetry he remembered from celestial constructs and ancient eternal sanctuaries, yet it was not an exact match. Every line was slightly altered, every curve shifted, as if seen through the lens of a universe that had taken familiar blueprints and rewritten them with different rules. Not home, but a reflection of it, a celestial echo shaped by another reality. The sensation reached into him quietly, like a hand brushing the edge of a scar. He had thought the Celestials were far behind, defeated not in power but in purpose, their grand design shattered by defiance. Yet here their pattern lingered, bleeding into this galaxy through a wound stabilized by worshippers who did not even understand what they were opening. The cultists below chanted on, swaying as if the sound itself held their bodies upright. Their faces were hidden under cowls, but their posture sang devotion. This was not chaos frenzy. It was ritual precision, feeding the tear with belief and sacrifice the way old temples fed gods with prayer. The Marines fanned outward, bolters tracking targets, waiting for the moment to disrupt the circles. But Ikaris's focus tightened on the tear itself. Cosmic energy in his cells responded to its pulse. A faint resonance built between him and the breach, the way two tuned instruments begin to hum together in the same room. The echo beyond was calling to what powered him, not to worship, but to the cosmic frequency the Eternals were designed to channel. That meant the tear was not merely a random wound. It was keyed to his nature. Either it had opened because of him, or it had been opened to draw him in. The realization arrived slow and heavy. Someone is using cosmic law as a doorway. Someone is trying to anchor a realm of celestial design inside a galaxy ruled by warp gods. If that succeeded, it would not bring peace. It would bring new masters, new tyrants, new pantheons feeding on mortals under a cleaner, brighter mask. Around the circle stood armored guards. Their plate was tall and ornate, not imperial, yet built with a sophistication far beyond this feudal world. Symbols glimmered on chest and shoulder, shapes that looked like suns, wings, and spirals of cosmic geometry. The guards were mortal, not eternal, but they were augmented, infused with energies that made their stance unnaturally confident in the shadow of a dimensional wound. One figure in particular carried the tier's rhythm in its armor. Golden plate shimmered in time with each pulse, and a spear-like weapon crackled with light that did not resemble warp lightning. The leader's presence felt like a bridge, a living pillar planted between realities to keep the doorway stable. Titus spoke quietly into Vox, relaying what they saw to Orbit. Ikaris did not listen to the channel. His mind was already moving. The Golden Leader was not a chaos sorcerer. It was something else, a vessel, an anchor designed to harmonize with cosmic energy. If it had been built to match his frequency, then his arrival had either enabled this breach or been anticipated by it. The thought kept its shape without panic. This galaxy's wars are older than I knew. His role here was not accidental. Whether celestial design or warp manipulation lay behind it remained unclear, but the wound showed that cosmic powers were now entering the same battleground as chaos and the Immaterium. A new pantheon was stirring, and it was wearing a familiar face. He felt the weight of the tier settle against his senses like a hand around the throat of reality. The valley was a hinge point between universes, and every pulse was a countdown. The cultists fed it. The Golden Leader held it. The realm beyond waited with patient hunger. Ikaris met Titus's glance briefly, then looked back to the breach. The choice ahead was sharpening into a single line. Disrupt the ritual, destroy the anchor, or seal the wound by force of his own cosmic power. Whatever path was taken, the valley would not remain quiet for long, and as Marines began to take firing positions along the ridge, the story flowed forward into imminent war, the golden echo turning from revelation into threat. The first bolter volleys cracked from the ridge and stitched into the outer ritual circles. Hooded bodies jerked and fell, chanting breaking into ragged fragments. The golden tier shuddered in response, its clean pulse turning uneven for the first time, like a heart skipping under sudden pain. The armored guards moved immediately, not in panic but in disciplined countermotion, forming a protective ring around the leader while returning fire with weapons that spat thin lances of radiant energy. Then the air bent. A ripple spread across the valley floor as if reality had been dipped into water. From within that distortion, a figure unfolded into view, tall and robed, robe edges drifting without wind. The face was hidden beneath a helm shaped like a beaked mask, and a staff rested in one hand, topped with a spinning sigilli that never blinked. The presence carried no brute wrath like the blood cultists, no rot, no ecstasy. It carried calculation. The valley felt colder the moment it arrived, not by temperature, but by intent. The chanting that remained did not stop for fear. It stopped because the new voice sharpened it. The sorcerer spoke, and every surviving cultist straightened as though pulled by strings. The words were not offered to the Immaterium. They were offered to the tier itself, to the unseen forces behind it, to the wider warp that listened hungrily from beyond the veil. Ikaris felt the syllables scrape against his mind, flickering with meanings layered like knives. The figure named him without knowing him, calling him outsider, catalyst, living key. It spoke of design, not chance, of a path woven through stars to bring cosmic energy into the warp's grasp. The air thickened with sorcery. Streams of shifting light snaked upward from the cultist circles, then curved toward Ikaris like vines seeking a trellis. He felt them press at his aura, testing his cosmic frequency, trying to harmonize it to the tier, not to destroy him, not yet, to bind him into alignment with the breach so it could widen cleanly, so it could become permanent. In that moment, the enemy clarified. This was not merely a chaos incursion. This was a scheme to turn him into architecture, a living anchor that would let a new pantheon step into this galaxy wearing stolen cosmic law. The sorcerer raised the staff, and the valley's light shifted into prismatic streams, trying to refract his will into pieces. Ikaris did not answer with a shout. The refusal came steady in the bones, and cosmic energy flared to meet the incoming warp patterns. The sorcerer's calm curiosity tightened into predatory focus as if delighting in resistance. Around them, Marines advanced down the slope, firing in controlled bursts, while the golden tear pulsed erratically overhead like a wound struggling to stay open. The confrontation had taken shape, and the valley held its breath for what came next. The sorcerer's lattice of warplight struck again, denser, more precise. It did not burn the flesh. It sought to edit meaning, to rewrite the resonance between cosmic energy and reality until Ikaris belonged to the breach. The sensation was intimate and cruel, like a hand trying to turn a key inside his chest. For an instant, the echo beyond the tear brightened, recognizing the pull, leaning closer to the threshold. Ikaris stepped forward into the pressure instead of away from it. Flight lifted him clear of the burial stones, bringing him level with the leader in golden armor and the shimmering edge of the tier. The guards below raised weapons, but Marines cut them down in measured sequence, bolter fire hammering gaps through their line. The sergeant's squad held the ritual circles at bay, buying seconds at the cost of blood. Seconds were all that mattered. The golden leader thrust its spear toward him, arcs of radiant force slamming into his torso. The blow carried both physical impact and psychic weight, a strike designed to disrupt regeneration and drown cosmic energy under foreign law. Pain lanced through his body, sharp, familiar, endured, yet the leader was not the hinge. The hinge was the tier overhead, widening with each pulse of ritual and sorcery. He understood the shape of the trap fully now. The sorcerer could always find new cultists, new anchors, new vessels. If the breach stood, Olympus-shaped echoes and warp-hung gods would keep reaching. The only decisive act was to deny the doorway itself, not by bargaining, not by waiting for imperial pylons to stabilize it, but by forcing it shut with his own nature. He rose straight into the golden light. Cosmic energy surged from within, not as a burst of rage, but as a focused release, gathered through flight, strength, and the burning beams behind his eyes. Twin lances of light tore into the tier's heart, striking the pulse point where the echo realm bled through. The breach convulsed. Its clean geometry buckled like glass under hammer blows. The silhouettes beyond recoiled, their marble world wavering as if a mirror was breaking. Behind him, the golden spear struck again, punching through armor and flesh. The weapon's tip emerged from his chest in a spray of luminous ichor. The impact tried to pull him backward from the wound he was sealing. He held position anyway, body trembling under the strain, cosmic beams intensifying as if the stars inside him were being wrung out. The tier began to collapse inward around the beams, its edges knitting together in jagged spasms. Warp winds screamed through the narrowing gap, and the sorcerer's voice rose into frantic counterchants. None of it mattered now. He was not a key to be turned, but a lock forced shut. The golden leader faltered, armor cracking, its anchoring resonance unraveling as the doorway denied it. With a final pulse that shook the valley's stones, the breach folded into itself and vanished, leaving only empty air and drifting motes of light where a universe had been trying to enter. Ikaris dropped from the sky like a falling statue, spear still lodged through his body, and the battle shifted into aftermath as Marines rushed toward him through smoke and shattered ritual circles. The valley was quiet in the way battlefields become quiet when the last ritual dies. Wind moved again through the grass, carrying ash away from the burial stones. The remaining cultists fled, their devotion severed along with the tier. Marines advanced in disciplined sweeps, finishing stragglers, securing the perimeter, raising warding pylons out of habit even when the wound was already gone. Ikaris knelt where he had fallen, one hand braced against the ground, the other gripping the shard of the golden spear that still ran through his torso. Cosmic regeneration fought the disruption pulsing from the weapon's remains, closing flesh slowly, stubbornly, refusing to yield entirely to foreign law. Pain dulled into a heavy throb. Breath stayed steady. The world narrowed to the rhythm of healing and the distant footfalls closing around him. Sergeant Titus reached him first, dropping to one knee with the unflinching calm of a warrior who had seen too much to be startled by miracles. Medici tools came out, efficient and inadequate looking against a wound meant to kill gods. Ikaris snapped the spear midshaft with a controlled twist, letting the severed piece fall away from his chest while the embedded fragment remained lodged deep, its psychic residue still humming. Around them, the Marines looked at him with a different weight than before. Not devotion, not fear alone, but recognition. They had watched a being outside all Imperial categories deny a dimensional invasion by sheer force of will and cosmic power. In a galaxy that survived on symbols, that act became a symbol in itself. Above, the void was clean again, no golden glare staining the sky. Yet the warp's attention lingered faintly at the edge of thought, not screaming now, but watching, filing away memory. Chaos had lost a doorway. It would seek another. The celestial echo had been denied. Something that wanted it open would adapt. This was not an ending, only a refusal that reshaped the next move. Ikaris felt that truth settle without bitterness. The galaxy did not lack gods, it suffered from them. Chaos gods feeding on emotion, empire gods feeding on obedience, echoes of old pantheons trying to reclaim relevance through mortal blood. The tear had shown that cosmic law itself could be weaponized here. That meant his presence mattered, not as a savior to be worshipped, but as a blade that could cut through divine schemes regardless of which realm they came from. Titus spoke of future disturbances already detected, several sectors flaring with similar signatures. The tone was practical, but beneath it ran a thread of something close to relief. They had found a way to fight a class of threat even the Imperium feared. Ikaris listened, silent, then gave a slow, sober nod, not to confirm servitude, but to confirm direction. When he rose, still bleeding faint gold, the valley seemed smaller around him, as if the land knew something had changed. Purpose did not feel like chains today. It felt like clarity. He had not come to this galaxy to be crowned, and he would not stay to be claimed. But every god that preyed on humanity had just gained a new enemy who did not require faith to fight. As the strike force began its march back toward extraction, his steps steadied into their rhythm, carrying the story forward with quiet certainty. The Eternal had entered a galaxy of hungry powers, and the war for its mortals had found a new shape. If you hunger for more tales of impossible encounters in the dark Millennium, smash that subscribe button, and the Emperor protects those who support the channel.